Welcome to Journeys in Podcasting. I'm Chris Davis here in Bogota, Colombia, and today we're going to be talking to Lisa Westman about differentiation and assessment, which is a monster of a topic, but we'll try to fly through it. This is based on an EduWeek article she posted a couple of weeks ago, and it's basically an outline for a book, so we'll try to get through it as best we can. Lisa, what's your background? How did you come into your current coaching position?
I started teaching about 14 years ago, and I was hired to teach 7th and 8th grade gifted humanities. So it was a hybrid of English and social studies. And I went into the classroom and I thought I knew everything because I was 23, and most 23-year-olds think they know everything. And I had a really, influential experience with a parent who told me that I wasn't meeting the needs of their kid. And at first I was defensive, but when I took a step back and looked at it, I realized that I wasn't meeting the needs of their child because I was doing the same thing for everybody. And where else in life does that work? And so I went to work with our director of engaged learning. This is before the word differentiation was mainstream. It was 2001. And I said to her, I want you to teach me everything you know. I want to be able to meet the needs of these students. And she had been the gifted teacher prior to me. So I worked with her for several years, taught gifted there for 5 years, took a couple of years off, went back and taught gifted again in the same township. And I've taught gifted ELA in social studies and regular ELA in social studies since then. And then last year I moved into an instructional coaching role in our middle school 6-8, focusing on differentiation.
So these are slippery topics, and the branding of things in education can get very sensitive as you move from time period to time period and school to school. Differentiation, I immediately associate with MI theory, Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence, which later developed into learning styles, which has kind of gotten a bad name, but also this new wave of personal and personalized learning. Last year, when I read your article, I immediately was thinking, I just remember reading some of this a year ago, and there was a go back and forth between James Delisle and Caroline Tomlinson. And I want to start with this kind of more polemic idea, and this is not me speaking, but I think it might help ground us as a pivot point for discussion. But Caroline Tomlinson explains, I absolutely understand that differentiating instruction is not easy, but then I've never felt that teaching should be easy. Teachers are used to things being hard, so why should differentiated instruction be the exception? Then James Delisle wrote that differentiation is a failure, a farce, the ultimate education joke played on countless educators and students. Differentiation is promise unfulfilled, a boondoggle of massive proportions. The only educators who assert that differentiation is doable are those who have never tried to implement it themselves, university professors, curriculum coordinators, and school principals. So let's try and clarify so that we don't have to go back to the homogeneous leveled classrooms of the past. How can classrooms be a democratized space where all levels are successful? What's the advantage of having all these dispersed abilities in a class? Where do you start sort of arguing against that?
Well, the first thing I would look at would probably be the last point that I made in the guest blog post that I wrote. I would not disagree with what James said if you're looking at a very stereotypical standard classroom where the teacher is at the front of the class and you have mixed ability students sitting in front of you, and you're going to have more of that, stage on the stage model. I do think differentiation is hard because you're not necessarily changing the assessment or changing the instruction to meet the kids. And to do it in that format, there's only one person, and the onus is on the teacher. In my experience, when the onus is on the kids to do the work and the teacher is there as a facilitator and working one-on-one with the kids or in small groups and getting that information, and you change the way instruction looks in the classroom, it's almost impossible to not differentiate then. But I think when he says that it's a farce and the only people that have tried it or no one's had success with it, I've heard that from a lot of people, and I think it's because people are trying to do it, fit a square peg in a round hole. Differentiation is not going to be best with one teacher in front of the class and everybody doing what that teacher says. that will not necessarily bring about any change or be in the best interest of the students. It's looking at what a classroom and what learning is differently.
So you quoted Rick Wormelli, one of his tweets, where he says, far from being a detriment to student learning, differentiated instruction is the only way we can teach all students, not just the easy ones. Mm-hmm. And, Lesley did say, and this kind of leads to another John Hopkins thing I read. He says a few readers expressed in the reviews of his article, a few readers expressed concerns of how little gifted students benefit from differentiated in heterogeneous classrooms, which was one of his major points. In the John Hopkins report that I read recently, they talk about how in 4th and 5th grade classes you could have up to 11 different reading levels, 11 different grade levels of reading within one class. How would you, I know you've taught high school, but I'm sure you still came up with a lot of these issues. How do you use this strategy of the one-room schoolhouse where, learning is more of a system, where you have your kids that more advanced some concepts can be explaining to other kids, where that can be a real advantage to everyone as opposed to feeling like everyone, certain segments are not getting serviced?
I think it comes down to how you're going to design, as the facilitator, what the students are going to be doing and taking into account what does success look like for all these students. And, you may have read John Hattie, he talks about the success criteria. What is the success criteria for what we're doing with this lesson, unit, whatever? And it doesn't necessarily, everyone's not going to take the same path to get there. The students need to have a clear vision. The teacher needs to have a clear vision. And then it takes a little bit of creativity to have groups work together. So if you take students with different abilities and you want to group them, I think is what you're saying, in a group together and they can learn from each other, they also can tap into each other's strengths, and they aren't necessarily all doing the same thing within a group. So if you have if you're doing, I don't know, I'm thinking of, groups that I've worked with in the past. I worked with a math teacher and we did a small group where the students were a restaurant. One person in the group was the manager and was doing a certain thing with the same information, using the same skills, but at a different level than a person in the group who was in charge of being the buyer and getting the food for the restaurant. And so it's tapping into the different levels and giving the students something to do with the material that is at their level that they can then share with the other people. So everybody still has a responsibility and everyone's going to learn from each other, but those responsibilities are different.
This is, I think, misconception 2 on your article, where you'd say, I differentiate by grouping students by reading ability and giving them leveled readings. This was the misconception. You said this is tracking within a classroom setting. Mm-hmm. Level texts don't necessarily address the specific needs of students, which are often unrelated to reading ability. Yeah, thank you for writing this, by the way, because this to me was super important. Of it's not the text and the level text itself, but it's what we do with the text. And this seems to be at the core of like why we have kids read in the first place, that it's not just deciphering what this text is, but it's what we create with it. And I kind of labeled this as like another misconception was the Common Core and, UVD, which is a great, planning format. Bloom's taxonomy, a great way to think about kids thinking, and Common Core, which is a workable way to get through a, form a curriculum. But at the same time, they're often like approached in a linear fashion where, you mentioned this idea. I'm kind of jumping all over the place into all of your misconceptions.
I do that all the time.
But I do have a driving point here. I'm getting to it. So the idea is that you have these kids responding to text, and you're mixing this idea of critical thinking with creative thinking. Where, this is very new literacies, that it's not just like how you critically think about something, but it's what you're going to create with that thing. As I was listening to one of your talks before, you talked about the Shark Tank projects with your kids and how you're focusing on these end products. This is, I don't know if you were a project-based school, if you're into project-based learning, but this sounds very much like, the driving part of a project is that you're not so focused on the individual task and chopping up things into little segments of time, but you're focused on this long-term event. Is that like one of your strategies, kind of planning to the event, planning to the creation of something, to pull a lot of these different abilities together? Can you expand?
For me personally, that is my go-to. I do like to think of things like that. I have trouble thinking of things, or at least when I was a student, and now that I have my own children that are in school, I have trouble when I see students doing work that I don't see how it's going to add value to their life. For instance, I don't like worksheets. I don't want to assign a worksheet for homework just to assign a worksheet. And to me, learning is all about thinking and figuring out what information you're lacking, where to find that information, how to decipher if that information is credible. And I also look at what resonates with people, and reality TV and social media and all of these things resonate with people regardless of age. So I tend to think of things like that are a little bit open-ended. So you brought up the Shark Tank. For me, that's creativity right there. You can come up with any product or business idea that you want, but in order to really make that product sell, you need to know quite a bit. It's not just about creating that product. It's about marketing it. It's about the need. It's about figuring out how you're going to manufacture it. And depending on what you create, you need to know different pieces of information. So for something like that, it was very easy to differentiate for my students because I had assessment data that showed me what skills they needed to strengthen. And I could use the text, and some of the text I found, some of the text the students brought in, to focus on those skills within this idea of Shark Tank. And you bring up the idea of PBL, and that's something I think I'm in between the traditional projects and PBL. I've seen PBL really well implemented, and I think that there's flexibility within structure. I've also seen PBL where it's like, what do you need to know, and now what are you going to do with it? And there's no direction, and it kind of doesn't go anywhere. So I'm kind of in the middle, like, here's Shark Tank. You're going to create a business. Some of you are going to pitch this business to an actual panel of sharks. Now, what do you need to know? What's the product that you think the world needs? Why? Who benefits from it? What's your, competitive advantage? How are you going to differentiate yourself? All of this, so the students are able to then have some choice and also engage in reading that's interesting to them, because we had kids that designed, technical things like cell phones, and we had apps that were designed, and then we had other kids that opened a restaurant. So they were all doing very different things, but they needed to engage in a lot of the same thought process. So when they're in their groups, they can discuss that. Like, I had this idea and I just Googled it and I found out there are 4 other companies already out there. So now I can't do this anymore. And then you hear another kid say, well, to me, that means that there's a market demand for it. There aren't any other companies like mine. How do I know anyone's going to want this? So it engages the students in those conversations without me necessarily guiding that. It just naturally happens after I've modeled it, a couple of times.
If we could stay on that Shark Tank project just for a second, you talk about this idea of standards, and to me, you use the word springboard, which to me was like the perfect way to think about, for me anyway, how to use standards effectively. In that, often I think teachers are used to approaching them like, okay, we map out our standards, and now let's start planning to them. But when you take a project like something like Shark Tank, did you let the project drive into the standards, and the standards become kind of springboard for going even further? Because to me, a lot of the problems with our education system is that we often put parameters around the kids' learning. And so in a project atmosphere where you don't really have such strict parameters, where the kids are driving to an event or driving to a product, and, they're much more likely to go much deeper. They're going to be much more invested in this aesthetic, effective, ethical connection to the learning that we sometimes talk about. Whereas if you were just planning to a standard, then it's kind of like you want to make sure, okay, they showed that kind of thinking, let's move on to the next thing. How did you plan that? Like did it start with project? Did it start with standard? What was the relationship there?
I knew the summer before the school year I wanted to do Shark Tank. The standards to me, and I think I said this in my article, were like a gift. So I took 3 years off when I had my children. And during that 3-year period of time, the Common Core standards were written. And I came back and I started, and everyone's talking about Common Core standards. It's going to be horrible. It's going to be the worst thing ever. And I was like, okay, whatever. And I've always been in the mindset, like, we'll make it work. I'm not that worried about it. And then I actually saw the standards, like, this is amazing. Like, this is going to make our lives so much easier because these are all skills that we need to have. And like you said, I think the biggest problem is you can't check them off the list. There are certain things, especially in the younger grades, that are very like, show that you can do this, addition and subtraction, for instance, or counting. But when you get into the middle school and the high school, they build upon each other. And so you naturally can go deeper. And we have discussions all the time, my colleagues and myself, about what does mastery of certain standards actually look like? For like the C3 framework for social studies, you might master something within one content area, but does that mean you've mastered it for every content area? Not necessarily. So when you look at those standards as skills, and then for us, we have our tier 1 curriculum, that everyone's going to be assessed on the same standards. Look at those. What are we assessing at this point in the year in this unit? How do we also assess those using this Shark Tank is the vehicle for that? And as I said earlier, it was very easy because they're all, what is the author's purpose in this article? Find the counter argument, all of the things that you can do, you can critically think using those skills and standards. And also I think that, and I've seen a lot more written about this lately, but something that I think is really important is having the students read the standards and asking them, what does this mean to you? Because a lot of times we will take standards and put them in student-friendly language, but it's still not the students actually digesting what it is that they're going to learn. And not just reading them aloud, but then sitting with them. So how do you think this would look? What do you think you would need to do to show that you understand this? And when you're having those conversations, at least for me, I always find out more about the student as a person. What are they interested in? What has been their past experience in school? And taking all those little pieces of, that's data too. It's not, numbers, but it's information that can help me to plan for those students when I have those numbers as well. Because the numbers in isolation don't really help me get to that student if I don't know what else might be, an obstacle or a barrier or a preference for them. So I think it's, like I said in the article, just putting all those pieces together and not being afraid to try something. But it goes back to, again, if I want to just stand in front of the class and teach, I don't know the best way to differentiate like that. I don't know the answer to that, which is why I said in number 5, that's a misconception as well.
Yeah, and this idea of the authentic conference. You wrote student conferencing to co-evaluate student progress, co-design their learning process. Not only is conferencing a type of formative assessment, but it's an opportunity to model effective questioning, gain insight into student thought process, and offer students ownership of their own learning. I often, when you think about student-centered learning and all the different spectrums it goes through, Montessori, Waldorf, Buck Institute, design thinking, project-based driven, but even within the most rigid instructional, high accountability systems, direct instructional, high accountability systems, I think that a meaningful student-teacher conference with an empathetic approach, with deep listening to student thought, can still give students ownership. Can you talk about the importance of the formative assessment, but done through this conference? Like what would that look and feel like in a project where different kids are working on different things? And you say, like, the data point, the number is only going to give you sort of a very kind of broad-based measurement of something, which is very subjective. Mm-hmm. Where would you weigh sort of your anecdotal notes and, more importantly, transmitting this idea that the student is in control of the direction of this learning?
So I'll give you an example and to move off the Shark Tank, because I feel like I've talked about that to death. But I had students a couple of years ago on a pre-assessment. They scored very high on this pre-assessment, so I knew they didn't need to spend as much time on the content or the skills in that unit. There were a couple of things that they needed to work on. So I was going to compact the curriculum, the Tier 1 curriculum, and give them an extension. I had about 6 kids in a group of, I think, 15 or 16. So I had that data point. Then our school district uses NWEA or MAP data. So I had their MAP fall score and then their goal and the area that, you know, they were strongest in, and then the area that they could use, you know, additional work or, you know, practice in that area. So I had those pieces of data, the hard data, okay? And I knew I was compacting the curriculum. So I brought all of the students over and I said, let's look at how you did on your pre-assessments. They all had their data. Let's highlight which skills that you scored, you know, below the passing line or whatever you want to call it. These are the skills that we're going to work on for this unit. You're going to do this, this, and this with the Tier 1 curriculum, but then we're going to do a passion project, or independent study, whatever you want to call it. But not everybody working in isolation. Everyone's going to design their own project, and then as a group, you'll work with each other to figure out what you need and bounce things off of each other, et cetera, et cetera. So small group talking about what we need to do moving forward. Fine. Then you move into the small or the individual conferences. The student and me. In one instance, I had 2 students working together. So I met with those 2 girls at the same time. So to give 2 examples, in one of my classes, I had one student, he sat down with me, he was gonna, you know, do this extension, and I said to him, what is your favorite thing to do? And he said, watch CNN, I love politics. And I said, okay, great. What do you wanna do with that? Do you wanna just watch it? Is it something else that, you know, you wanna pursue? And he's like, I wanna debate politics. That with somebody who knows what they're talking about, that's what I wanna do. I was like, okay, that's what you wanna do. Let's look at your MAP data. What does this tell us that you need to work on this year? Literature, I need to work in literature. I don't like reading. Why don't you like reading? I only like nonfiction, that's why I scored high in informational text, et cetera, et cetera. So together we looked up some literature, fictional accounts that had to do with politics. And I was like, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna design this project. Let's choose one of these books. If you don't like it, you can put it away and try another one. Let's try reading a piece of literature that's about your passion. You can, you know, decipher whether or not you think it's accurate. And at the same time, let's look at these skills here. Let's do this through current politics, and we'll do some reading, and we'll try, and I'm not so worried about what you do on the last day, because that means you're prepared and you're ready to go. If your goal is to debate somebody in politics, pretend you're going to do that. Get ready for that. And if that happens, it happens. And if it doesn't, then I'll pretend I'm your, you know, debate partner. And for him, it worked out that he was able to debate with somebody from Fox News. So that's one student. Another student in the group, her passion was fashion. She wants to be a fashion designer, and she loves Project Runway. And she has all this to say about Project Runway. And her area that she needed to work on was informational text. She needed to read more nonfiction. So she did that. She wound up blogging for a fashion blogger as her end product, but along the way kind of worked with this fashion blogger to kind of, why don't you read this? Tell me what you think about it. Why don't you read my post and see if you can find any things that you disagree with and why? But those 2 students, even though they had very different passions and very different end products, still came across some of the same stumbling blocks, which was, if I want to write for a fashion blogger or I want to debate and do this, how do I set those things up? How am I prepared for these interactions with these people on the outside? And so those types of processes are something that the kids can work together in the group, regardless of the content and regardless of how they're going to show their learning in the end, if that makes sense. So I start with the data is the opener for the conversation, have them explain it. They usually ask questions. And then I always get into that. If you could do anything, what would you do and why? And usually you'll get a question back like, well, I could never really do this. And then I'll say, well, why not? what are the obstacles? How do we overcome those obstacles? So I just think it's a way to really know your students, and then they're creating what they're going to do. I'm not giving it to them. I'm helping them get there, but they're creating it.
No, it sounds like what you're explaining is a great framework or recipe for doing project-based learning in a higher accountability system where you do have to follow, show accountability to these standards and things. I wonder if I could kind of push you a little further there and talk about kind of like nodes and systems, individualized learning and the importance of the group as well. Because it sounds like you use group critiques within the class as well, that students are working on their individual projects, but they're also accountable to giving feedback to the group. Do you have any, I've seen different ways of doing this. I think the ultimate is Ron Berger's book on critiques and excellence, or I'm not getting the title right, but it's an excellent book. And then, I've looked at design thinking of how they run their kind of I like, I wish, I wonder. Any kind of hints on like how to get this culture of collaboration going between students in the class?
I think for me, it really just starts with setting the tone the first day. And the most important thing, I always go back to Jim Knight, who's written, many books on instructional coaching. He has the big four. And classroom management is one of the big four: instruction, assessment, and content. If you don't have that classroom management piece, which to me does not work in a punitive culture, it's not like you didn't do this, you get this. It's we're all here to do the same thing. I just have more experience in the classroom because I've been here longer, but really this is not about what I want. This is about what you are going to need and what you deserve to have. And so I think right from the beginning, I always, spent the first week like building that classroom community so that it was kind of an expectation that everyone was going to respect each other, because I modeled that. The students, if there was ever an instance where they didn't, which of course I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and there were many instances of that. And I wasn't always good about it. There were plenty of times where I could have handled things better, but I would try as often as possible to go over and be like, what's going on here? What's a better way that we can discuss this? So instead of saying, I don't like working with these people, it's how can we better work together? Like, what can I do? And just kind of modeling that, which I've been very fortunate to work under and with some really exceptional teachers and administrators. But I had an administrator during one of my observations say that to me, like, what if you explicitly teach some of these, sentence stems in discussions? And I was like, right, that's a great idea. And it's something as simple as that, like having someone there and then being open to that. I didn't take that as a negative. I took that as that's a great idea. I want to try that. I think it's, as far as systems to have that happen, I think the only system that I always adhere to is just being genuine. And I'm genuinely interested in the answers to the questions that I ask. And if you're not, the students can tell that. So if my method of conferencing isn't right for the teacher, as a coach, I would work with them to come up with their method of conferencing, because I have a very dynamic personality. I'm very talkative. I'm very animated. Not everybody is like that. So my questions won't necessarily work for somebody else. So I think it's kind of, we have to differentiate the way the teachers conference with students as well. And it would get boring if every teacher conferenced in the same way.
Well, yeah, I'm hearing that you come kind of pre-programmed with this mindset of collaboration, of your ideas are important, I'm going to build on your ideas. I think what I was thinking more was sort of how would you use something like the sentence stems or the starters, or Project Zero uses the thinking moves, so that kids have a way of looking at learning, using the same kinds of language, using the same kind of thought patterns, just to get things started as a platform for opening it. But at the same time, I've also, read things that say collaboration can't be scripted, that it has to happen in an organic, way, that human thought and human behavior interactions are so complex that the more we try to impose these structures, the more artificial it will be, and the more kids will say, that's BS. I'm not going for that.
I like I said, I like a very strong foundation. Like I love analogies. So if you think of building a house, I want the house to be as strong as possible. There could be a hurricane, there could be a tornado. Nothing is going to blow that structure down. But what you do on the inside of that house, how you furnish it, how you decorate it, that is where the flexibility comes in. So it's my job as the architect to set the foundation and make it super strong. But my students will come in and they're going to furnish and decorate the house. So I kind of look at it like that. And to go back to, you mentioned some of the infographics, I believe, that the movement and the sentence stems. The sentence stems, I just started using those. I made those last year with another teacher, and she gave them to her students. It was actually in a math class, and they were a little bit different. I kind of changed some of them to make them more general because she wanted to start math talks. She had never done math talks before, and she wanted the students to have something in front of them in case they got stuck. And it worked very well for some of the groups of students. The movement in our district, it's something that teachers, when administrators do walkthroughs, they want to see the students moving around. And we know it's best for students to incorporate movement for learning. It's good for your brain. And so that was something that I didn't know that research until, 5 years ago or something. And our administrators demoed some of those in our institute days or our staff meetings. And then I came up with a few of those on my own. And then I tried them out in the classroom. So those are all, not only do they involve movement, but they all involve collaboration. So those are all opportunities to see how you collaborate and see how you collaborate with different people. And again, that goes back to the whole idea of grouping the homogeneous or heterogeneous. Those are usually done whole class. So depending on how you structure it, everyone's going to be talking to different people at different times. And it's a good way to have some organic discussions between students, even though they may be working on, reading something in a different, or seeing things from a different way than their classmates, or being asked to do something different with the text.
When you're talking about this research on, it sounds like you're talking about space and classroom design even. And one thing that some colleagues and I've been looking at is this idea of hacking active learning spaces, of when you can't afford the steel case chairs, when you can't afford the really high tech interactive stuff for the classroom, how could you create that anyway with whiteboards and Post-its and cleaning out wall spaces and getting furniture away from the walls so that the walls become interactive interfaces, just like our screens are. Is this the kind of stuff you're playing around with, or are you talking about something else?
No, I thought you were, that is something that I was thinking about. I thought you were talking about, you said something about the students moving around. I thought you were referencing something I had created with 9 different ways that students could move in the classroom. Classroom spaces is also something that I think is important, regardless of the furniture. I think you could get really collaborative looking furniture and not do anything different. So I hate to do stuff like that. I'd rather, try it out without the furniture and see, what are you going to do? The furniture is just, again, just looks pretty. But
it's like the fancy tech equipment that, throw a bunch of iPads in a classroom, but it's just a tool. And if nothing in that environment is interacting with that tool in the way that it was designed for, then you're not going to get any outcomes that you're looking for.
Exactly. That kind of stuff is, it's not just about making things look pretty. It's about making sure that they're substantial. But no, I think, so to answer your question though, I think there was a question there, so correct me if I'm wrong, but
don't worry.
If you don't have the means to go out and get all of this really fancy furniture, and what can you do? I think any setting that you have, you can make collaborative by what the students are asked to do, and then being creative about the space. Like I had a closet in my classroom that was underutilized. I mean, it was huge, and there was, storage in there. But when we had students Skype with professionals, we used to say you can go in the office, because you couldn't, my class, there were other students working. So that would be the office, and they would say like, Skype in session. They would close the door and they would do their Skype in there. Our tech coach, she was my coach at the time. Now we're on the same team together. She's like, I have a portable green screen. We'll put the green screen in there. And so then it became like students could produce things with that green screen. So it kind of evolved. But it was never like, I need this, this, and this for kids to Skype. It was just like, the kids are going to Skype. They're either going to do it at their desk and it's going to be a little loud, or they're going to go in the closet, or they'll sit at my desk, or whatever. I think once you start to see what works, then you redesign the space, and the furniture is a bonus if you have it. Wait, I lost you. I can't hear you.
Sorry, my mic got muted. I've done that a couple of times where I go on talking for like 3 minutes and nobody says anything, and then all of a sudden I realize my mic was muted. So anyway, what I was saying is, our former director my former director is really big on this idea of using the very strong metaphor, like the architecture metaphor for a school system. Here's our structure. The foundation is here, the pillars are here, and everything has a particular meaning as far as curriculum and instruction and finances, everything. So looking at sort of this idea of the system, and I was looking at thinking like, I must be an architectural spandrel, like the ornamentation in between the fixtures. But I think you have a very good point of using these things like structures, the Common Core, kind of like pillars, but then you work around them and weave through them. This is sort of off topic, but I'm kind of thinking about, this is a common theme that we talk about, and it's this idea of output and outcomes. Output meaning this is what the designing learning objective that you're going for, but then you often have much larger learning outcomes. And one of the best places I've seen this talked about is in Making Learning Visible out of Project Zero, where they talk about documenting a lot, but using the documentation as actual way of teachers reflecting on what was learned, not only what was supposed to be learned, but what were the larger outcomes that came out of that. How do you follow your students through these projects? Do they have blogs, portfolios, Google Docs? Like, how do you track the individual progress going on, especially when they might have many different routes they're going through?
So that's, I would say, a work in progress. I've tried many different systems, because I think that's a little bit, that's more on like for me, so I can ensure that I know that my students are making growth. And I've used a variety of, the year that I did Shark Tank and the year that I did the Passion Projects, I used a colleague and I created like student self-tracking grids. And she created one, I created one, and mine was terrible. It was like really convoluted and confusing. So I wound up just using hers. But then I still didn't like it, because I was like, they're not really, I don't think tracking their learning means like 9 out of 10, or like it's, what do I still need to do? And I felt like there needed to be a more organic way of tracking, because I never, aside from like, my numbers when I go to the doctor, like my blood pressure, my weight, all of that, I don't really track much with numbers. I track it with like, the effect that I'm having, and, how are people responding to this, whatever. So I think the portfolios, it's something that, in all honesty, I've been working with some teachers on. I didn't do it myself, but using portfolios, digital portfolios, makes it easier, but not as a showcase, as a way to document growth. So, and I wrote a blog post, you can read it if you want, all of my different ways that you could use digital portfolios, and a lot of people have written about them. Setting a goal for the student, it could be related to, a goal area that they get from some type of assessment, or it could be just a goal on their own. I want to write more succinctly, or whatever they want to do. But taking those goals, and if it's in a middle school or high school, not having them exist only in one class period. So not having that goal only in their ELA class, but that's their goal. So we look at school, it's like you have ELA and then you have science and you have social studies, but you're just learning. You're learning all day. What is your learning goal? How are we going to see this in all of your classes? And if the student understands their goal and what they need to do, they're pulling those pieces and putting it in their portfolio to show their growth, which can continue into the next year. I feel like I've achieved my goal, my evidence, that my next goal is this. And in math, I'm going to do this with my goal. And in English, I'm going to do this if it needs to be like that. If it's a learning goal, it should be applicable in every class. And so to answer your question, if I was back in the classroom now, that's what I would be trying to do, is using a digital portfolio for all of those pieces directly related to a specific goal that would be the overarching goal for the student.
And you do bring that, it's a main point in your article. I pulled that out as one of the main points, this idea of the quantitative and qualitative assessment that, we're so focused on getting these numbers in the grade book, but the real power is in these formative stopping points. I taught elementary, so it's a little bit different, but I think it does relate in that, like, the most authentic way feel like I've ever given kids feedback and felt on top of their learning was very non-numerical. It was came out of the balanced literacy program, and the kids every week would write me a letter about whatever they're reading. And at the beginning of the year, it's completely open. They can write whatever they want, but they have to write me a letter once a week. And every day I'd take 5 letters and I would spend about an hour to an hour and a half reading the letters and writing the kids back. So the kids the next day come in, they've got their letter and they've got my response stapled to it. And then we conference that day, so that there was this constant dialogue going back and forth. And then we would pull, because I was so in touch with their writing, I would pull segments of their writing and then throw that on the screen and teach off of it. So that, like, whatever they were writing became a very alive piece. And this is all done through their sustained silent reading period. So that, like, but mid-year, this is like the kids' favorite time of the day, I think, because it was the most personal and the most authentic part. This is what kids want in their learning. They want human contact and human feedback.
Right.
They don't want to sit there and look at a rubric. And I mean, even though that helps guiding discussion and that can help, like, okay, this is what we're driving for, but those are simple little tools that we use to pivot ourselves into these meaningful conversations. And, I think that's what you're getting at, and using this digital portfolio is a very authentic way to get into the kids' thinking that is, not so as intrusive as, like, throwing down numbers or making them feel they're in this panopticon of constantly being prodded and observed as the subject in this education study or whatever. Sorry, I'm kind of going off, but
well, I have 2 things to say. 1, you're exactly right. 2, I love the idea of the writing the letters for the reading for 2 reasons. 1, it's not reading logs. I hate reading logs. I don't, for any kind of independent reading. But 2, that's another way to differentiate for students that may be less comfortable talking one-on-one with the adult initially or all year. Some students, and if you think about, like, why social media is so popular, a lot of it is, or texting even, it's not face-to-face, it's less intimidating, and people are more willing to say things. So that's another way to differentiate for students. If they're hesitant or you're not getting a lot out of them when you're having meetings verbally, the letter writing is a great way. But to go back to the portfolios and what you said about it being authentic and the students taking ownership, the feedback piece is also critical. So depending on what system you're going to use for your portfolios, students can, pull out whatever that they want to show as evidence, but teachers can too. And then the teacher can offer feedback on what the student pulls. So the student might pull something and say, I'm using this as evidence that I synthesized information. And then the teacher can say something like, well, I see here that you pulled this and you pulled this. I'm not sure I'm understanding how these 2 things go together. Can you elaborate on that? And so rather than looking at that portfolio as an example of my best work, it's an example of my learning process. So the teacher is also critical in providing the feedback within the portfolio, both for the student, and then if the parents are interested in looking and seeing what's going on, then they can see that as well. But all of this is very different than what we're used to. You think a lot of people will think of portfolio as I'm going to go and I'm going to show all of my best work. But in order to get that best work, what about all the work that went along the way? How did you get to that point? And that's as we've been talking all along, the process is as important as the end product, if not more.
Yeah, and it makes me think of the words that I really do not like to mention in this podcast, but one is growth mindset. And the other is grit, of like just focusing on the process part. That, yeah, product is the driving part. That's the Bloom's taxonomy turned upside down, that we're driving for this product that's going to show off all of these skills.
Mm-hmm.
But the fun and the grit of learning is all there, is the stuff in between. And that's the part that I think the digital portfolio of having these different modalities of input of, kids can produce any kind of media or voice or record themselves doing something. Plus you use that, asynchronous connection that, kids have this, we all do, I guess. We have these strange relationships with our devices, and what we'll produce with them is often really different than what we'll produce in front of the class. And we've mentioned this before in our podcast before, of like when we first do iPads in the classroom, the amazing thing was, one, it was just immediate collaboration tool. Like one iPad with 4 kids around it was like magic. I mean, the kids were just all of a sudden talking and figuring things out together. The social construction of learning was just like vibrating. And the other was the encapsulation of when a kid who is not usually in the airwaves in class, who may have difficulty producing language. In particular, I'm thinking of one who just had the difficulty of processing oral language, but then would go off to his cave space with the iPad and 30 minutes later come back with this beautifully iterated multiple times and have a real product to like then share with the class, and everyone can start their feedback. It sort of invites everybody into that space. And
I think what you're saying there is another example of why we need to differentiate, because if that student who has trouble presenting things verbally, if that's their only option, then they're going to be set up for failure, especially if there's some type of physiological reason that they do that, which sometimes there is. So that doesn't mean that they can't show that they've learned the information or share something in a different way. It's really about just looking at things differently. And the idea of mindset, I agree with you. I think we need to be really careful about using that word, because, when people say you need to have a growth mindset, I'm not sure everyone understands exactly what that means. And it's about the characteristics of a growth mindset, and not even calling it that, but just saying, talking to kids for what it is. It seems like you are really down on yourself and think you can't do this. Why? What has happened in the past? What do you want to do? Do you want to change it or do you not want to change it? If you don't want to change it, let's work on something else. And not trying to change kids. So not taking that student you mentioned who had trouble presenting verbally, not taking our goals for them, not saying like, you need to speak in front of the class and be good at it. You need to show me that you understand this, or you learned this, or you mastered this. How do you want to show me? And not putting what we think kids need to succeed on them. And I think sometimes, myself included, we do that. And I think some of it is a protection. Like, we want the students to be as prepared as possible, but sometimes we don't recognize that the world is different and the kids see things and have experiences that we never had. And how do we, let our guard down a little bit as protectors too.
Well, and we talked about this danger of branding at the beginning of how quickly in the education realm, things can fly off into these crazy polarities of extremes, where I don't believe that Duckworth or Dweck had any bad intent or any malicious intent on this concept of grit and this concept of growth mindset, but how quickly they can be construed and become vehicles of racism, just like totally ignoring environmental racism and ignoring an environment as a factor. But yes, there is a balance there. Like, kids cannot think of themselves as victims of their environment, but at the same time, learning is a very, very complex system. sorry, I'm flying all over the place again, but
No,
last night I was looking at
Carol Dweck's book was one of my favorite books that I ever read, and I've watched all the videos that she's done. And I think the problem is similar to differentiation. People hear that as a buzzword and they think they know what it means, but they don't actually have all the information. And what I hear a lot now is like people using that word directly with students, like you need to have a growth mindset. And there's beautiful pictures about the difference between fixed mindset, growth mindset. And I think that those things are all helpful, but we need to not overemphasize the language of it, and just the actions that support that are more important than just the rhetoric, I guess.
Yeah, no, and just kind of backing up from there, before differentiation, I guess we talked about how it was learning styles, and that all developed out of MI theory of Gardner. And, even before he termed that multiple intelligence theory, he had a book called Art, Mind, and Brain, which was one of the first real education books that I read. It was like my first year teaching, and my mother gave me this book. I have no idea why, and I just happened to read it, and then it just stuck. There's a chapter called Max and Molly where he talks about how kids use illustrations, one in a very symbolic form as a backdrop for narrative, and one, the narrative is embedded in the illustration, that as the kid is drawing, he is actually giving kind of a chronology of his thoughts. Which was just totally fascinating, because it makes you think, like, I need to look at, how my kids are drawing. This might be an incredible vehicle into their thinking, which is a form of differentiation. So using those kind of tools of, look, this kid's really into artwork. Let's tap that and see if there's, some literacy elements there we can pull out of that. One of the most amazing projects, Betty, sorry, her last name is fading right now, but Betty was an art teacher at my school in Barranquilla, and she had a special art class once a week that ran for 90 minutes. They let her do it because the cognitive development going on in this art class was so incredible. And I would just sit in there and watch, never really understanding what was going on. But then I would take the kids' portfolio outside, put on a cassette tape recorder at the time, and literally just interview the kids about one of their art pieces. And this one little girl goes on for 25 minutes about her volcano, which is a symbol of Colombia. And look, Colombia is bleeding. Here's the lava coming down, but the water is purifying all the pain. I mean, it was just like so over the top for a second grader. And I realized, like, all of these little points of differentiation and these modalities, these are pivot points for kids to catapult their thinking through different symbolic forms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
So I want to ask you another question. This is something that I've struggled with as well, but when you're a classroom teacher, you have your own lab, and you can tweak and experiment and play with this environment. You have all these tool sets, and yet when you step out of the classroom, it's a very different experience. How do you feel about that, like, as far as looking at the ability to impact all of this idea of differentiation? Teachers are very complex entities, and when you start coaching them, it's a very different step away from the learning process of the kids. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. What are my thoughts on?
I mean, you've been a classroom teacher for 14 years, and now you're in a coaching position.
I see what you're saying. Okay. So how do I feel about working with the teachers rather than working with students? Okay. So I think that adults are different than children, obviously, because one, we're getting paid to do a job, and it's your livelihood, and you're emotionally attached to that, if for no other reason, because it is your livelihood. You've had different experiences along the way, and you've had more experiences. So just how I said with the kids, if they're not engaged, what's happened, why are you at this point? Adults have had more years of that. Also, I think the older we get, the more, set in our ways we are, and the more stubborn we can be, and the more defensive. And I haven't seen a whole lot of difference working with teachers is working with students. I've just changed the questions, and my responses are a little bit different, but it's the same thing. If I'm working with the teacher, why are we working together? And, why is this important? And if your classroom could look any way, how would it look? And what do we need to do to get there? And I think that it really hasn't been that different. And I don't know. I feel like I get how hard teaching is. And I think any teacher that is willing to even look inward and try and work on something, that's already like a step in the right direction. Our district doesn't use coaching as a mandated form of professional development. I mean, the coaches lead professional development sessions, but it's totally up to the teachers whether or not they want to work with a coach. And so I see it as my role, just as it was my role to engage my students in their learning. It's my role now to engage teachers in wanting to set a goal for themselves and letting me partner with them on that. So yeah.
I love this idea that the teacher choice, that the teacher comes to you if they need or want to know something or want you to help develop something. Last night I was looking at some older data from 2010 where, I don't know if you saw the LA data experiments where they rated all the teachers in the entire district of LA by number. It's really scary stuff. But if you really want to see like how brutal it can be, but what's beautiful is the teacher comments, and the teachers just rip it apart, but they also nail it. They talk about like, hey, this is, we're only one factor, and it's not that we're trying to throw the blame on someone else, but we feel like all the blame is being thrown onto us for this incredibly complex system that we call learning, that the environment itself is an entire system. The teacher's a very critical point in it and probably the number one factor of student success, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that we get scapegoated for everything. But if you look at sort of how we think about teaching, how we reward teachers, raise to the top kind of initiatives, Bill Gates studying teachers and trying to figure out what makes the perfect teacher so that we can then replicate a whole bunch of these. What do you see from your perspective? What would you change in our system so that teachers are focusing on the right things, so that they do have the freedom to investigate and really delve into their student learning and not get pulled so many different directions? As what I feel about it is that they're just held accountable to so many things that they're just racing from accountability point to accountability point and missing sometimes the real beauty of having this learning environment right in front of them. What do you think?
I think that's
not to get you in any trouble with your school.
No. I'm not worried. In my district, I don't agree with a lot of what I hear about. Teachers are overloaded, and I think teaching is stressful, and I think teachers are asked to do a lot, and I don't think that teachers are paid what they should be paid. However, I have lots of friends that are not teachers, and they all feel stressed, and they all feel like they have a lot on their plates. And I don't think that there is any profession that doesn't have that. My dad always says they call it work for a reason. And I guess I just agree with that. So what I would change a million things. And some of them would be popular and some of them would be very unpopular. And we can discuss those at a later date. But if I could change one thing that I think everybody has the power to change, so rather than like, a political change or a systemic change, I would change people saying that they have too much and they can't get it done and just try and do the best that they can. Because what I have found being a coach and working with teachers, especially the teachers that I've worked with time and time again, they are doing a really, really, really great job, and they are doing everything they can not to be held accountable to check them off, but because those things are what you're being held accountable for, they're based in research and evidence. We know that these things that you're being asked to do will ultimately benefit your students. No one's going to be perfect at all of these things, but if you can keep these things in mind and try to incorporate them as often and with as much fidelity as possible, your students are the ultimate beneficiaries. So instead of saying like, we're not going to get this done and why do we have to do it? Just let's not complain about it. It's work. Any job you have, there are going to be things like that. Just do it. And then what is your goal? If your goal is not the growth and success of your students, then I would say maybe this is not the right profession because I want my students to grow, and I'm not going to spend my time and energy being upset about something I need to fill out or whatever. And standardized tests, which often comes up, like we're held accountable. And on Twitter, people were very friendly and supportive. And on Facebook, 90% were supportive of my article, but on Facebook, there were some people that were not as friendly. And I appreciate that because it gives me something to think about. And I didn't disagree with some of the people that opposite opinions as me, but something I saw time and time again was why we can't differentiate in the classroom because standardized tests aren't differentiated. And I am going to write a blog post on this, but that is another fallacy. The reason you differentiate is so that everybody is prepared for those standardized tests. And if you're differentiating along the way, all of your students should do well on those tests. And I also have a question because I don't know the answer to this. What is everybody doing to prepare their students for that test by not differentiating? Because I don't know what's going to be on that test. I just have the same standards in front of me and I'm interpreting them the way I do. So my long answer to your short question is there are lots of systemic things I would change, which we'll mention at a later date. But the one thing I would ask is, while things might seem annoying or unnecessary, assume positive intent, know that these are ways to ensure that we are doing what's in the best interest of kids. And if we do them, our students are the beneficiaries. And I'm talking about things like differentiation and formative assessment and, students tracking their own growth and setting goals and all of that stuff that really does.
No, and differentiation, like we said, is one of those knee-jerk response topics that immediately throws people into a certain kind of thinking. But like when I read your article closely, I realized that there's a lot more depth here than just the question of differentiation.
Yes, thank you for I'm so happy about that. Differentiation is like one thing that
to be honest,
all these other things.
We didn't get to half of the topics. Like I said, this is an outline for a book. And I think somewhere in the literature when I was reading some backstory for this talk was that there are 600 and something publications just from the ASCD. Am I saying it right? ASCD? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just from their publications, there are over 600 books with the topic of differentiation. So just that's a giant topic, plus the whole idea of assessment. Mm-hmm. What is a real assessment? And we could talk for weeks just on the quality of a formative assessment.
Absolutely.
But it sounds to me like you have the big rocks very firm in that idea of like, look, that's where the power is when you talk to the kids in these formative assessment settings. This is where all of these things can happen, regardless of what the system is requiring of us around the exterior. This is the important moment. I know that you had, we can keep going. What is your time frame like?
I have about 3 minutes.
Okay. So why don't you tell people how they can find you? I am predicting that you're going to be producing a lot more. Your blog is great. And the Education Week article was a great find. Where else can people find your work? I would love to see more examples if you have it out there of things. I have the Shark Tank project of any of the kind of trying to track how a lot of these projects work within the classroom.
So I have at lisawestman.com. That's where you can find my blog. But I also have a page with resources. All of the projects that I've mentioned are linked there. Both some of the items I gave the students and then also presentations. So there's more of an explanation of not just how to do it, but why and the background. And so all of my thoughts and opinions, and clearly I have lots of thoughts and opinions, can be seen on the blog. And then the resources are also linked there and the infographics too. Or you can just connect with me on Twitter.
And we didn't mention Mark Cuban at all during the entire talk, but I'll save that for a later discussion. We'd love to have you back for other topics coming up. And like I said, we're looking at forming panels. So if you would like to join kind of a larger discussion, we'll send out an invite as well. Thanks so much for taking the time and connecting.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.